The Underground Railroad was Americans at their best at a time when America was at its worst. Hi there, I'm Pete Fenzel, and this is, in their own words, the story of the American experiment in the words of the people who made it happen. And today's episode is about the Underground Railroad, which was neither underground nor a railroad, but it was a loosely connected system of decent people of good conscience who assisted fugitives from slavery to reach freedom, whether that freedom was up in the northern free states or even further north up into Canada. Now, to understand why the Underground Railroad was really needed, you have to take a look at the conditions of slavery in the United States in the early 1800s. After the passage of our Constitution, the Congress passed a Fugitive Slave Law in 1793. That law persisted until 1850, when a second Fugitive Slave Law was enacted with the Compromise of 1850, but we'll get to that in a little bit. From the 1790s all through the 1820s, northern states had passed laws outlawing slavery, and several of the states had immediate abolition, but some states provided for gradual emancipation. So it wasn't until the 1820s or so that the North really became free soil in places like New York and New Jersey, which was the last state to emancipate enslaved peoples. Now, the hunger for personal freedom burned in every human heart, and there were fugitives from slavery all during this time. But the poor people who came up from slavery trying to seek freedom up in the North had no money, they were impoverished, they had no education, they had no knowledge of geography, they had no way of knowing how to behave and to comport themselves in a public situation. They had no way of functioning effectively when they got themselves up north, if they succeeded that far. And so 90% or more of fugitives from slavery who made it up north in the 1820s and the early 1830s were captured and returned back into bondage in the South. And it wasn't until 1835 that a fellow named David Ruggles, who was a free African American, his father was a free African American and a blacksmith from Connecticut, and he established a vigilance committee and offered some assistance to the fugitives from slavery who came to New York. And he first started out at 1 Cortlandt Street in Lower Manhattan, where he established a grocery, and then he established a bookstore and a printing press there, and finally a reading room. But that place was destroyed by mobs who objected to his activities. New York City was a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiment. Indeed, the economy of New York City was very much dependent upon the institution of slavery, probably even more so than Charleston, South Carolina. Back in those days, the United States had 3 major commodity crops. They had cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and all 3 of these crops, these commodities, were produced by slave labor. And so the economies of the southern states were dependent upon the production of those commodities. However, the banks in New York and the insurance companies in the Northeast, they financed the growth of these crops. They financed the insurance of these commodities and of the enslaved peoples who were producing these crops. And so the financial interests of the major institutions of the Northeast were just as deeply entrenched in the system of slavery as were those in the South. Indeed, the shipping companies who transported these commodities were dependent upon commodities produced by slave labor for their prosperity. And so you can see how a place like New York would be deeply invested in the success of Southern slavery. Now let's get back to 1835 and David Ruggles. Despite being beaten up and mobbed, he reestablished his reading rooms and libraries and Lispenard Street, which is near the corners of Broadway and Canal Street in Lower Manhattan. And there he set up shop again. And he invited free African Americans to come in, and he also housed and sheltered fugitives from slavery in his house. One such person whom he did help was a fellow named Frederick Bailey, and he had run away from slavery down in Maryland and had made it up to Philadelphia by rail and then up to New York. And he was helped by David Ruggles, and he later changed his last name to avoid detection from slave catchers to Frederick Douglass, who we all know as the famous orator and lobbyist for freedom during the Lincoln presidency and for the 10 years before. Now, David Ruggle was beaten up so many times by mobs and maldoers that his health was severely impaired, and he died as a young man at only 39 years of age. But he established a new system that defied the established order. He was invested in the notion that forceful opposition to slavery was essential in order to assist the fugitives from slavery to accomplish their own personal freedoms, either in the North or even farther north in Canada. 2 years after he established the Vigilance Committee in Manhattan, then William Stills, another African American, established the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. And that committee was instrumental in forwarding fugitives from slavery who came up through Washington and Baltimore and Wilmington, Delaware, up into Philadelphia, and helped them move on to the next station stop, which would be New York City. And William Still was incredibly effective in helping fugitives from slavery to accomplish their goal of freedom. One such fugitive whom he helped was Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman, being the beneficiary of his help, turned right around and made 13 separate forays back into the South, back into Maryland, and liberated 70 people from bondage herself. Then later on during the Civil War in 1863 or so, she was down in the Sea Islands off of South Carolina assisting the Union Army as a cook, as a scout, as a spy. And she went behind enemy lines, and she guided 2 Union gunboats staffed with African American troops to disrupt Confederate supply lines and to liberate over 700 people from slavery. Frederick Douglass said of Harriet Tubman, "Excepting John Brown of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people." So these are 3 of the major personalities of the Underground Railroad. We don't know how many thousands of people were engaged in the process of assisting fugitives from slavery to reach freedom. But there are 2 more fellows that we're going to mention as we go along. Let's take a look at the structure of the Underground Railroad. There wasn't any in the earliest stages. There were good people of conscience who made their best efforts to help the fugitives from slavery as best as they could. It might mean just letting them stay overnight in their homes in secret. It might mean providing them shelter from a storm or a meal, and then moving them on to the next station along the railway. But it wasn't until the 1850s, when the new Fugitive Slave Law was enacted, that the Underground Railroad took on a more organized and structured aspect. Under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the accused fugitive could not testify in his own defense, nor was he entitled to a lawyer. There was no trial. There was only an appearance before a commissioner who was paid twice as much to send that person into slavery as he was to acquit him and allow him to go free. And so the system was rigged to find that the accused person was actually the fugitive slave. It didn't matter to the slave catchers who he was as long as they could catch a slave. And the reason for this is back in 1808, the slave trade was forbidden and outlawed. And so we could not import more and more slaves into the country, which made a limited supply, and therefore that slaves themselves would become more expensive. And when you lost a slave, you lost a great piece of property. And to replace that slave, you didn't really care very much whether you got the same person, whether you got another fugitive slave, or whether you got a freeman, and you just kidnapped somebody to fill the void left by the fugitive. Slave catchers now came up to the north in force. And it was very difficult for those who were coming out of bondage, who had no education, no money, no knowledge of how to comport themselves, to make their way up into Canada, where they were free from any recapture under the Fugitive Slave Act. In the Eastern Seaboard, there were thousands of small craft that were plying trade up and down the Atlantic coast. And so the ocean was one way for many fugitives to make their way up, either to New York or even farther to New Bedford or to Boston. Those who were farther inland wound up coming up through Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and Wilmington and Philadelphia and up to New York. And then once they made it up to New York, they would be sent up to Albany, out to Syracuse and Rochester, and heading out that way to Canada. But the major route and the great majority of fugitives from slavery made their way to freedom through the northern part of Kentucky along the Ohio River, bordering on Ohio. And that's where we are today, looking over the Ohio River here in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which was one of the major areas for the escape of fugitives from slavery, coming up through Kentucky, up the Mississippi River, up the Ohio River, and then across into the free state of Ohio, and from Ohio up to the Lake Erie ports of Toledo, Sandusky, Cleveland, and Ashtabula. And those four ports were the major points for taking steamboats across the Erie, Lake Erie, and over to Canada. Now, sometimes if they couldn't go into a steamboat, they would just make an end run into Buffalo and cross over to Canada that way. But that was the major route for the different station stops through Ohio, getting up to Lake Erie, in order to send the fugitives on their way beyond the reach of the slave catchers. Now, in the area from Cincinnati all the way out to Ripley, Ohio, there were many, many people of goodwill who helped out the fugitives. We are now standing at a spot where children back in the 1940s and 50s would play here in the woods and go down underneath an old abandoned house into tunnels that were dug here into this hillside, right here where we're standing, that were escape tunnels for the fugitives from slavery, who would make their way to the banks of the Ohio, where conductors of the Underground Railroad would meet them in a small boat to carry them across the Ohio River and then onto the next way station along the way. The most prominent of the conductors, and he was also known as an extractor, was a man named John Parker. And he brought many of the fugitives from slavery down to a town called Ripley. Now we're going to go visit Ripley, and we'll broadcast from there and talk some more about John Parker. Okay, we are now upriver from Fort Thomas, Kentucky. We're now in Ripley, Ohio, about 50 miles or so upriver from Cincinnati. And we're in Ripley because Ripley is the seat of the most effective route for escape on the Underground Railroad in the United States before the Civil War. Now, Ripley had a large population of abolitionists, primarily because it was in the middle of the Virginia military district from the time of the Revolution. And it's the last area where veterans of the Revolutionary War from Virginia were given land in lieu of pensions. Many of the men from Virginia who were of the Revolutionary era, who decided to come up here, took to heart the principles of the Declaration of Independence about all men being created equal. And so they wanted to free their own slaves, but the laws of Virginia made it almost impossible to do that. But if you brought your enslaved people here, you could liberate your slaves without any consequences. And so many men did that. And Ripley became a place where abolitionist sentiment was very strong. Now, right behind me is the John Parker House. John Parker was the most effective and successful extractor for the Underground Railroad, probably in American history. He personally made many, many forays across the river into Kentucky and extracted from slavery between 600 and 900 people and brought them back here at the incredible risk to his own life and freedom, and brought them back here across the Ohio, and then passed them on to other conductors on the Underground Railroad right here in Ripley, most notably John Rankin, Reverend John Rankin, the Presbyterian minister here. So you're here to see that this was really ground zero of the Underground Railroad. Major escape routes for the Underground Railroad came through this section of the Ohio Valley, with the Kentucky Highlands across the river to the south and the Free State of Ohio here on the northern side. So now we're going to go up to the top of the hill where John Rankin's house stands still. This is the John Rankin house. We're on the top of a hill overlooking the Ohio River in Ripley, Ohio. And this is the place where over 2,000 fugitives from slavery were processed through the Underground Railroad and made their way up through Ohio, across Lake Erie into Canada for the most part. The major ports that were used back then were Ashtabula, Sandusky, and Toledo. And the network from Ripley up north involved hundreds of people and many, many station stops, and required a great deal of money, not only to feed and to clothe and to transport the people, not just up to the Lake Erie, but also across by steamer to Canada. Now I'm going to turn the camera around and show you the view down to the river and across to Kentucky. Now, this house here was up here on the heights because John Rankin had a house lower down, closer to the river, but it was more vulnerable to mob assault. And Reverend Rankin, who was a Presbyterian minister here, had a lot of sons, and each one of them knew how to use a shotgun. And there were firefights aplenty by pro-slavery activists who were trying to stop the efforts of the Underground Railroad here. And John Rankin's family was well armed and well equipped to preserve their freedom of action. So they moved up on the top of the hill to have a more defensible position away from the mobs. And also, they put lights in the windows at night, candles in the windows at night, so that any slave over in Kentucky knew precisely where they had to go in order to reach their own freedom. Now, we were just down at the John Parker house, and John Parker brought between 600 and 900 fugitives from slavery up this hill and tendered them over to Reverend John Rankin, who was possibly the most successful conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now from here, they would be quickly processed, and by process it would mean that they were fed, because most of the runaways were extremely hungry. They might not have eaten for days. They were cold and wet many times, but the description that was given to the slave catchers had a description of their clothing, and so everybody who came through here would be given new clothes, so they would no longer match the description that the slave catchers were looking for. And they very quickly were moved out of Ripley up about 5 miles or so to the next Crossroads of Red Oak, where there was also a faithful congregation up there of abolitionists and conductors in the Underground Railroad, and step by step would be moved up at different stations in a highly organized, well-financed, and systemic organization that you now see on your screen, that brought many, many people, well over 2,000 people, up to freedom through Ohio and across into Canada. So now I'm going to turn the camera around so you can see the view of the river from up here. This is the view that Reverend Rankin would have from his front door of the Ohio River and the Kentucky Highlands across the river. This is sacred ground in the story of the American experiment, because this is where a great many destroyed the institution of slavery with their own 2 feet and their own courage. If anything, sacred ground like this space right here is living proof that the hunger for freedom in the human heart is far stronger and far greater than the greed and the fear of those who would enslave others. That's our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, would you please share it with your family, with your children, with your grandchildren, and your friends. Like us on Facebook if you would. Anyway, thanks for watching. God bless you.